So what's the difference between Oracle and Tarot decks? Some of you guys have been asking me this question, and obviously since I use both, I'm probably a pretty good person to ask. For the purpose of this video, I am going to be using the thing that I have that's the closest to a standard Rider-Waite tarot, and who don't know what that means, I'm going to explain that too, because I think this is going to illustrate the point I'm about to make about tarot decks probably the most clearly, and then I'll show you a few different Oracle decks too as examples. Now, before I get into Oracle decks, I am going to talk about tarot decks just a little bit, because I think even people who are familiar with tarot may not be super familiar with this system, and that is the biggest differentiator between tarot and Oracle is the structured system of the cards. So I'm going to briefly go over that and then just kind of use more examples and talk more. So if you already know this about tarot, bear with me because you might hear one or two things that are new to you. You might not, that's okay. But we are going to talk about that first because it's going to make the Oracle part make way more sense. So when you look at a standard tarot deck, and again, I'm using what I have that's the closest to a traditional Rider-Waite, there are 4 suits in the minor arcana. And the minor arcana, if you don't know this, that is actually what's closest to a deck of traditional playing cards. So just like you have like aces, you know, diamonds, etc., those are the 4 suits in a standard playing deck. Well, in tarot, you have pentacles, which is earth, and you have wands, daggers, and cups. I always forget about cups because it's emotions. And each of those corresponds to an element. And so you'll see some decks get like really complicated where they get into a lot of the like elemental symbols and all this other stuff. But the system of the original tarot is the thing that most people really anchor into. Like everybody knows pentacles is earth. And so that's the stuff that's like worldly matters, wealth, material things, basically earth, right? And then cups is emotions and relationships. And so that's water. And then you have, and this next part is always the part that confuses me. So if you get confused, don't worry about it. You have swords, which correspond, I'm going to use my cheat sheet here. Swords corresponds to air, which is intellect and thinking. And then wands is fire, which is creativity, or in some cases, action. So I don't really understand why swords is air. Like that part is the one that just never makes sense to me. So honestly, that was the hardest correspondence for me to learn when it came to learning the system. But knowing the system of the cards makes learning tarot so much easier. But again, that's the biggest difference between tarot and Oracle is most Oracle decks are more thematic. So when you pick up an Oracle deck, you're not looking at 4 structured suits, you're looking at just a theme overall for the most part. There's some exceptions. So just hold that thought in your head because that is one of the biggest differences, but I'm going to explain a little bit more about tarot and then we'll go into that a little bit more. Okay. So you have the 4 suits in tarot and that's part of the structure, but that's the minor arcana. And then within the minor arcana, the numbers like aces, you know, 2s, 3s, blah, 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 the number cards, those numbers always mean the same thing. So like an ace always means something new and a 2 always means like duality, like a choice or, you know, a partnership if it's emotion. So when you learn the structure of the cards, again, that helps if you remember the system versus memorizing each card. So if it's like a 2 of cups, it's always going to be relationshipy, right? 3 is always like teamwork when it comes to like the intellect and the fire, or again, in the relationships, 3 is like friendships, a circle of support, celebrating with your friends, etc., etc. So anyway, so the numbers always mean the same things, and then you apply it to whatever the suit is basically. And that is the number cards. And then you have the court cards, which is like the page, the knight, the queen, and the king of each suit. Those also always mean the same types of things, and then you apply it to the thing. And then you have the major arcana, which is what a lot of people really vibe with when it comes to tarot. Everybody loves the major arcana cards. And so that's the things like the Fool, you know, through, what's the last one? I always forget this, the World. So I do have a cheat sheet here because I don't memorize them. I don't. So I know like what the themes of each number and each suit is. And then for the major arcana, I know what each of them kind of means. But like some people have like all the numbers, like, you know, the World card is number blah, blah, blah. Like I don't go that far. That's just not my jam. I'm not a memorizer, to be honest. I'm like a viber. I'm an intuitive reader. And so I really do like you know, I pick up on like the vibe of the cards, even with tarot, and that's what I go with. So it's really important though that you understand when we say structure, when it comes to tarot, that we're actually talking about the structure of the deck and how that works, because it really helps you remember it. And then tarot creators, they might have a theme of the deck. And so like this one that I showed you, that's the closest to the Rider-Waite, the artwork is very similar to the original Rider-Waite tarot. Now, did tarot start before Rider-Waite? Yes, but the Rider-Waite tarot was an art style and deck that was produced that really like fired off modern tarot, basically. Like tarot is a super old system. That is a whole other video, by the way. But Rider-Waite popularized tarot in the modern world, basically, with this kind of art style. So these are the standard Rider-Waite cards. And again, this is what, when most people think of tarot, this is kind of what people think of. Now, you can have themed cards on top of that. And so like when you see me do my readings, and you might have watched my explainer video where I talk about like which decks I use for which readings, but this is the Under the Oak tarot. And so the theme is trees and forest. And you can see here that the artist has really, you know, I think sometimes it's easier to interpret the themed cards because they're conveying like what the card means artistically. Rider-Waite does that too, but for some reason that art style I don't find as intuitive and emotional as some of the decks that I really vibe with. Like if this card means too many choices, does not look like too many choices, you know what I mean? So for me, that makes it easier to interpret. So what happens with the themed tarot decks is that the creators of the decks kind of have their own vibe that they're applying, and it's like an additional layer of meaning on top of the standard meaning. Or sometimes it's exactly the standard meaning, but they use the artwork to express it in a way that is more accessible to people like me, right? So those are different things. But like I have all these theme decks. I have like the Buffy deck. I have all this other stuff. And it really, like sometimes it colors the interpretation. And then in the guidebook, the deck creators go into a lot of like detail and information about like, you know, what their additional interpretation is. And sometimes it is a little bit different than what the standard one is. So it's worth reading them. But when it comes to tarot, even though it's a structured system, it doesn't mean you have to 100% follow the rules or the interpretation. So even if you bought a themed deck, for example, and you didn't vibe with the explanation and you just wanted to use the standard interpretation, that's up to you as the reader. Like it's really kind of what makes sense to you. And even with really popular readers, I see them interpreting standard cards a little bit differently. Everybody's got their own flavor in terms of how they interpret things, and there's nothing wrong with that. Now, one last thing about the major arcana in tarot is that is supposed to be like big themes, and then the minor arcana, you know, the suits cards, those are like a little bit more details or sometimes more day-to-day, right? So just kind of different levels and layers. Now, let's go to oracle cards, because I think this is where you're like, okay, I've been familiar with, you know, tarot is structured. So with oracle cards, for the most part, they're just, you know, 30 cards, 45 cards, and they may progress in a story, but they're not as like, there's no structure like that where they're broken up into like 10 of this and 4 of that. For the most part, some of them are like thematically broken up into the elements, but they don't have to be. So the oracle deck creators have so much more freedom where they can have like a theme, and then within that theme they can just have X number of cards. They don't have to break it up by element or by anything else. Some of them do, right? Some of them still do like fire. Honestly, some oracle decks, they actually do correspond some of their cards to tarot just to make it even more confusing. But again, think of that as an option. The whole point of oracle decks is that they're usually thematic in terms of like, this one's about romance and love, right? Or like, this one's about like witchy stuff. This is a witching deck, you know, oracle deck. And then this one is, I don't even know what this one is, but it's cute. It's like foofy. I don't know. So like the art style goes with the theme. But speaking of themes, and this is probably where this might get a little bit confusing, the oracle cards are also a little bit more thematically tied. So if you think about where I said the major arcana is about big themes in your life, whereas the minor arcana is more about like details, you know what I mean? Like a couple clicks down. So the oracle cards are probably somewhere in between the major arcana and the minor arcana, or are at the major arcana level where it is themes about your life, not necessarily like this is what's going to happen next week. Like this specific thing going to happen. Okay, I can't say theme anymore because clearly it's like getting stuck in my mouth. Okay, anyway, but let's talk about the journey really quick, because one thing I didn't explain about tarot that is really important, and again, if you're close with tarot, you probably already know this, but if you are this close with tarot, you probably aren't watching this video. So we talked about the system and the structure of tarot, but what we didn't talk about was the thematic journey. So tarot, the first card in the deck, starting at 0, not 1, starting at 0 is the Fool. I love starting at 0 because 0 implies infinity, like infinite possibilities. So the Fool is starting off on a journey with optimism, you know, he's hopeful, like he's literally setting off into the wilderness. And tarot decks, no matter what theme the artwork is in the tarot deck, it's always expressing the same thing about the Fool. He's like jumping out into space, or he's like about to enter the forest, like in the oak deck or something like that. I wish I had the Fool card handy. That would probably have been smart. But anyway, so think of it as like, if you're used to fiction writing structure, the hero's journey. That's effectively what it is. Like the tarot deck is telling the story of the hero's journey. A really good example of that in literature that you might be familiar with is Alice in Wonderland. That is a standard hero's journey, or Lord of the Rings, right? Innocent girl or guy hanging out somewhere, something happens, the inciting incident, and they have to go off on this journey, and they're full of hope that they can accomplish their mission, basically, right? Although in Alice's case, she kind of fell down a rabbit hole, but you get what I'm getting at. That's the Fool moment, basically, is that setting off part where you're innocent and full of optimism. And then along the way, you know, you meet these characters, or you're evolving into the characters. So you meet the magician, but also in some ways you're evolving into the magician where you're manifesting. Same thing with the high priestess. So these can be characters that you're meeting along the story, but you, the protagonist, are also picking up aspects of these characters. Like, I'd love to be the magician manifesting reality. Who doesn't want to be the magician? You know what I mean? So you're like progressing through the story as the Fool. Does that make sense? So that's like the hero's journey and progression of the Fool throughout the tarot deck. And the last card of the major arcana, the World. Like, you've accomplished what you needed to accomplish. Like, the world is yours, you know, effectively. You're wise, etc. Then you reset and start over on a new hero's journey. Okay. So I hope that makes sense. And the reason I'm saying that is because oracle decks, they don't necessarily follow that same progression. If they're modeled after tarot, which I have seen some that are, they might do a story arc within the cards. That's actually very, very rare that the cards itself imply such a progression of like personal and character development the way that tarot does. So again, oracle decks are more about like insights, themes, you know, connection in some way. I use a lot of them for like symbols. And so if you are here because you watch a lot of my readings on the other platform, you'll see me using this deck all the time, because like I'll pull this one. I love using this one for symbols of things people can watch for as confirmation of the reading, or as, you know, guideposts on their journey. So by the way, whenever I mention signs, it's always guideposts or getting attention when I say signs. But I love this deck. It's cute. I mean, it's little, obviously. I love little decks because I personally have small hands, even though the camera angle makes it look different. I digress. But anyway, so I like these for looking at symbols. But there's no real story necessarily in this one. There's a theme. And I love this deck. It's good for that. And then there's another one I use for symbols. This is an oracle deck, obviously. That's another oracle deck. This is the Practical Magic Oracle deck. So for this one, I have the Practical Magic Oracle and the Practical Magic Tarot. And same thing, like I'll pull this and pull signs or symbols. Now, these all also mean something. So I'll use these as like, look for these signs, look for these symbols, and they mean this. And then you can also use it as like a traditional oracle deck where you're pulling themes, but those are more detailed than some of these other ones. So I'm going to go back to the witch one, for example. So this is like a theme, book of spells, learn. You know what I mean? So it's like the theme of there's something for you to learn. Is it a lesson? Is this about education? And then the guidebook gives you a lot of details. But when I'm doing a reading, like I said, I'm an intuitive reader. So sometimes with oracle decks, I'll look at the guidebook because there's great information. There's great affirmations. There's great meditation. Sometimes in the oracle decks, there's great journal prompts too. So love, love, love the guidebooks. But when I'm doing like a million readings, I'm picking up on the theme of the cards intuitively more than I'm going into those details necessarily. And you'll see that a lot on my lives, for example, where I'm just going so fast, I'm getting the answer, I'm getting the theme, and I'm like moving on. But sometimes for my own personal use, or if I'm doing private readings, then I will provide some of the additional information about the affirmation, you know, the meditation, the journaling prompts, like really sitting and thinking about, well, what does learn mean? Where are you in your, you know, life's journey in a certain cycle that learn is significant to you? Like pause and think about that. Does that make sense? So depends on how you're using the cards. So depending on how you're using the cards, that's actually a good segue into my next point, because with tarot decks, your mileage may vary. So there's like the rules in the system, and then there's what you do. And they don't always have to be exactly the same thing. I've noticed for me, I'm going to use the word structure again, so bear with me. Please be patient. I swear there's a point. But I don't do structured readings, meaning I don't do like the Celtic cross. I don't do, the 7 of this and the 4 of that. That's just not my reading style. But with tarot, you have the option to do structured readings where, you know, the sequencing of the cards means something specific. And an easy example is past, present, future. You do a 3-card draw, past, present, future, right? That's an easy example of a structured card reading. But oh my gosh, do they get way more complicated than that? So I don't do that. When I read, what I do is I'll pull a few oracle cards to get the theme of the reading to like set the vibe. And then I'll do my tarot cards and I'll use that to like get more detailed. And I'll be like, okay, I know that this reading was about learning. And so all of these tarot cards are about learning and like your journey. And honestly, for me, the cards come out in a storytelling sequence. Like I'll get the Tower, and then I'll get like, what do you need to do? And then I get, what does the future look like in Tower being like near future, right? And then I'll ask questions, by the way. So if you're not asking questions when you're reading, I'm curious what you do. So I just ask questions. I'll be like, who is this for? Like if I'm doing collective readings, who is this for? Or if it's a collective reading, but I know I'm doing it for one of the zodiac signs, I'll be like, okay, what does Aries need to know? What's going on for Aries? Or I'll be like, what's the month ahead? So I frame it and I set the context. It's not completely open-ended, like I think I was making it sound like it was. But the way I lay the cards out, that's where I'm like, I don't bother with the structure because I've asked a specific question. And then I'll ask another question. I'll be like, well, what do they need to know? Or if I'm getting like all these like rough cards, I'm like, oh my gosh, they're like going through it, right? You've seen my readings where I'm like, oh my gosh, they're totally going through it. Then I'll ask the cards, well, how do they get out of that, right? And then the cards will give me guidance on how they get out of it. And then I'll be like, okay, so what do they have to look forward to? Especially if it is coming across as kind of negative. I'm like, okay, what is the good outcome? What are they working towards? Or if they do these things right, what does that outcome look like? Or if I know somebody's going through such a rough time, I'm like, what can I tell them that will give them hope? That is a question I ask the cards a lot. So asking the cards questions, whether it's tarot or oracle, is super important. I'm not trying to go off on a tangent about how to do readings, but I actually think that explaining the process of using each kind is important in terms of like understanding like, well, why would you use both? You know, like why isn't it one or the other? Well, for me, I like the information about the theme. And so even though the major arcana in tarot is about themes in your life, it doesn't give me flavor. you know? And especially since I do collective readings where they're not prompted by someone like calling me up and Gabby, what's going on with my love life? You know what I mean? Like that would be a flavor or a theme, love. But I'm using the oracle cards to set that theme and understand that's what someone needs to hear. Because again, I do a lot of collective readings, not just personal ones, you know? Otherwise, you can say, okay, this is a love reading, so what do they need to know about love? But the theme could still be cycles. It still could be about learning, right? It could still be about like soul journey. There still could be bigger themes at play that I don't necessarily think tarot alone answers, at least not for me. So that hopefully explains why someone would use both kinds of decks. Now, are there times where I only use oracle cards without tarot? Absolutely, especially for my personal readings and for my group of really close spiritual practitioners. Like when I do polls for me or for us, a lot of times it is oracle only because I'll just be like, what's going on? Because in those cases, I'm not asking what to do. And I think maybe that's when I use tarot specific is again, when I want more details about like, well, what do I need to do? Or what does so-and-so need to do? That's when I really pull out tarot. And to be perfectly honest, I'd be more than happy to do collective readings or private readings just with oracle cards. But I think sometimes, if not most or all of the time, my clients or my collective, they get a comfort from seeing the oracle cards. Like there's just some sort of comfort people get when they know that you're using tarot and not just oracle. But also a lot of times it really is the level of detail about the answer. Because for me, it's that, what do you need to do? What do you need to know? How do you navigate through these themes? Tarot seems to serve that more. It's like oracle is either like 10,000 feet or it's in the weeds with the symbols. It doesn't hit that in between that I think the minor arcana in tarot hits. So I hope that makes sense. That's kind of the difference between tarot and oracle decks is, you know, structure versus 100% thematic. I would love to know if you guys do readings, like which ones you prefer or why, or if you think there's like more differences. I haven't met a lot of readers who blend them both as consistently as I do. I find people are more tarot or more oracle. Personally, I vibe more with oracle, but when I'm reading for other people, blending them gives me the most useful answers. So that's what I do. But personally, I resonate more with oracle cards. I love them. I love the artwork. I love the themes. I love the way that they like get my mind and my spirit like going, if that makes any sense. But for actual useful readings, yeah, tarot plus oracle for me. So I'd love to hear from you guys about what you think and what you use, etc. And I'll put a link in the bio to my storefront where I have almost all the decks I use regularly are listed on there, except for the ones that are only available on, you know, a different platform. Like this is Etsy only, for example. This is not available on Amazon. So I do have some decks that are Etsy only. So those ones aren't on my storefront, obviously. Okay, anyway, thank you so much. I'd love to hear from you. And if this was helpful, please, please, please like and subscribe and leave a comment, even if it's just an emoji. It helps so much with engagement. Okay, thanks.